Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 19 of Energy versus Climate. My name is Ed Whittingham, and I'm joined by my webinar co-hosts, Sarah Hastings-Simon and David Keith. Now, my first serious dive in today's topic, carbon capture, was back in 2008 when I was still with the Pembina Institute. Pembina, together with the then Institute for Sustainable Energy, Environment and Economy, aka ICE, at the University of Calgary, hosted a carbon capture and storage thought leader forum. And as part of that initiative, I ended up working closely with a professor that I only sort of knew before that, a guy named David Keith. And David, remember that you not only gave a terrific dinner address that evening, but you also managed to MacGyver the laptop we were using to project slides after a colleague dropped it on the conference floor.
Oh, I remember that. Yes.
Yes. Proving you are the Swiss Army knife of energy and climate. In the lead up to the forum and following, we published a bunch of research papers that we felt answered everything you needed to know about how to deploy CCS effectively. Because many of us at the time thought that we were on a cusp of an explosion of CCS projects in Canada and globally. Well, the explosion ended up being more like a fizzle. And 13 years later, it feels like we're on the cusp of explosive CCS growth again, or as we say now, CCUS. The buzz is definitely back. But will it be any different from that previous time, carbon capture 1.0? And if yes, why? If those questions interest you, then you've come to the right webinar and podcast. We've enlisted the help of a terrific guest to answer those questions. Dr. Sally Benson is a professor of energy engineering at Stanford University and a director of Stanford's Global Climate and Energy Projects. She has held several positions with the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory in Berkeley, California, a wonderful place. She sits on a half dozen prestigious advisory councils and co-directs the Stanford Center for Carbon Storage and the Stanford Carbon Removal Initiative, all of which makes her very qualified to speak with us today about carbon capture. And I had the pleasure of sitting with Sally on the Carbon Management Canada board back in the early 2010s. So welcome, Sally.
Well, thank you very much. Appreciate it.
All right, the usual housekeeping notes. Sally will help us with a bit of a CCUS 101 to start, after which the four of us will chat until about 35 minutes past the hour. Following that, we'll get your questions. You can send your questions in via the Q&A box throughout the webinar. Please don't use the raise hand function or the chat box. And our wonderful colleague, Mika McFarlane, will screen for live questioners. If you want to pose your question to us in the flesh, well, virtually, but on our video screens. So without any further ado, let's get to the 101. So Sally, maybe let's start with understanding what we mean by carbon capture. So what are the differences between carbon capture and storage, aka CCS, carbon capture, storage, and utilization, aka CCUS, the term we tend to use now, and carbon dioxide removal, aka CDR?
Okay, well, let's start with CCS because that was actually the initial topic that everyone got so excited about. So carbon capture and storage is basically a suite of technologies that separate carbon dioxide from a concentrated source typically. And that separated CO2 is compressed to a liquid, it's put in a pipeline and then pumped deep underground for permanent storage. So that's CCS. So then, it was in the 2010 or so, the idea of CCUS came along. And that's the idea that, well, if you've gone to all the trouble to capture that carbon dioxide, it's a shame just to throw it away as if it were a waste. So why not utilize it? At the time, the single biggest utilization would be to pump it underground to accelerate extraction of oil, so CO2 enhanced oil recovery. Of course, though, that's a little bit contradictory if you're trying to get rid of emissions. So there were sort of mixed views about that. Nowadays, people think much more broadly about utilization. It's, well, let's use it to make chemicals, to make plastics, to make fuels. Imagine a circular economy where you could utilize that captured CO2. Also, you could put it into cement and make stronger cement, as an example. So that's utilization. And then CDR is carbon dioxide removal, sometimes also called negative emissions. And the idea is that you deploy a technology or suite of technologies, again, to extract carbon dioxide from the air and then either reuse it or sequester it someplace where it won't get back into the atmosphere. So those are the sort of three core technologies that are sort of at play today.
Okay, great. Now, before we go any further, I want to take one issue off the table for the rest of the discussion, and that's safety. So I know we've been getting gases out of geologies for decades upon decades. We've been re-injecting them. We've been transporting them. Many people in the province where I live, landowners, have acid gas pipelines crossing their land. Is it safe? And thinking of the non-utilization cases, if you're putting in a concrete, I get that. But is capturing, transporting, and storing CO2, say in saline aquifers or even depleted oil and gas reservoirs, safe?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So to start off with the capture process itself, it's just like any industrial process that, worker safety is a key issue. You have to put in place proper protocols for doing that. But yes, properly implemented, that can be very safe. Putting it into pipelines, there are over 5,000 miles of CO2 pipelines in the United States largely, but also other places around the world. Those are operated very safely. And then finally, I think really the big question everyone has is if you pump carbon dioxide, deep underground, will it cause damage to groundwater, or will you have catastrophic leaks that could be harmful to individuals or facilities?
Yeah, or microseismic activity, that
or microseismic activity that would damage, surface structures.
Yeah.
So here's what we know, that we've basically been injecting CO2 underground since 1975. And this is a widely used practice. About 3% of the oil in the U.S. is actually produced with this, and it has not been documented to damage groundwater or result in surface hazards that are any different than traditional oil and gas operations. With regard to saline formations, again, we've been doing this since the 1990s, and again, that the sites, all but one of the sites, have performed extremely well, and the CO2 has safely stayed underground. It has not resulted to damage to natural resources, groundwater, not resulted in surface releases of carbon dioxide. The one place where there were some issues, which was a project in Algeria. It was later discovered that really the site wasn't suitable, that the rocks were just so impermeable that it was just too hard to inject the CO2. And that did result in a minor leak through an abandoned well. But other than that single incident, it's been very safe. Now, with regard to microseismicity, again, microseismicity has not been an issue with any of the CCS projects that are operating today. There is concern about underground injection of really any kind of fluid. If you do it at too high a rate, the pressure buildups get to be too high, and those can induce seismic events, particularly in fractured basement rocks. But again, this is a manageable problem. We simply know that you need to limit the injection rate per well so that you can avoid having those seismic events. And this is now very, very well understood, not from CCS, but from just wastewater injection. There's been a tremendous amount of learning over the past, say, decade or so.
Okay, great.
I'd pile in for just 1 second, really based on learning from Sally and working with her on this IPCC special report, that I think it's really important to say that we don't just think CCS storage is safe because of some theory. it's really this huge basis of empirical experience, as Sally was saying, not just the 40 projects, but the 100 years of natural gas storage, the huge volumes of waste injected underground. None of these things have been perfect, but that's in a way a good thing. It shows you that there are little problems, but they're problems that we understand pretty well and manage of putting materials underground in injection.
Good. I wanted to cover it off the top. Thanks for that. And I can say from having done workshops, community workshops in rural Alberta around the Shell Quest project, let's just say climate concerns were less of a concern at the time when you lived closely to an injection facility and a transport pipeline. Safety was actually paramount, but it's good to just establish what the record has shown over decades. Now, I want to get to the topic du jour, why we're here. So we've been talking about CCS and CCUS for a couple decades now. And, if I just went to the Global CCS Institute's CCS facility database this morning and screened for operational and commercial scale projects, I could only see 22 projects globally. Sally say there are 26. Let's split the difference and say, we've got roughly 24, 25 projects. Back when David and I did that thought leader forum 13 years ago, we thought sitting here in 2021 would have hundreds of projects. But now I see, there are like 30 plus projects under construction or in various stages of development, and a lot of them are proposed in the US. So we're calling this CCS 2.0. Maybe, Sally, you can bring us up to speed. Define CCS 2.0. What's all this activity that's happening now?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Let me get there in a minute. I want to talk about this idea of failure to launch. In 2005, the IPCC put out a report that said that carbon capture and storage could play a very large role in helping to decarbonize the economy. It was something on the order of, say, a 20% solution. It was never claimed to be anything more than that, but 20% is immensely valuable. And at the time in the United States, we were on the cusp of having an economy-wide cap and trade bill. Waxman Markey, anyway, eventually it ended up failing by one vote that they couldn't get to pass this. And I would say that was sort of the first real blow, because everyone had been gearing up that we were going to have both globally and in the United States, policies that would penalize emitting carbon into the atmosphere. So that was one, failure of cap and trade. Number two, COP15 came along. Everyone had very, very high expectations. There was going to be a global agreement on emissions reductions with targets and clear responsibilities. Well, as we all remember, COP15 in Copenhagen basically resulted in very, very little. So that was another, hit to this, because it was just, are we serious about solving the climate problem or not? And obviously, if you're not going to do CCS. Next came along the global economic recession. And if you remember, basically, the economies were really brought to their knees. Investment capital, absolutely dried up. There was a huge liquidity crisis, and basically investment wasn't happening. And then fast forward to, say, 2014, the price dropped out of oil and cut in half by about a factor of 2. So the major industry that was sort of being looked to and called upon to make those investments, was not in any position. So it was really a perfect storm. And at the same time, that was failing to launch due to really these macroeconomic, forces and global, toing and froing about whether, it was going to be serious about solving the climate problem. In the meantime, in places like the United States and Europe in particular, but others as well, put very large incentives, incredibly lucrative incentives on renewables, solar, rooftop solar, feed-in tariffs, the investment tax credit, production tax credits for things like wind. And so there were very large incentives. And moreover, there were mandates. These portfolio standards dictated that the utilities need to make purchases of renewables. And it didn't say you have to do, low cost renewables. It's like, you're going to go out and procure those renewables. which really helped those industries scale. So when we compare the CCS versus renewables, I mean, the bottom line is one had enormous incentives that were valued in the hundreds and hundreds of dollars per ton, and CCS did not have those same things. And at the same time, another really sort of macroeconomic trend is in the United States, they learned how to do fracking to get more natural gas out of the ground. It was really plentiful, it was cheap, and basically coal stopped being able to compete economically. And we started to see, really driven by economics, a coal gas shift. And at the time, the paradigm was CCS is really for coal, and that gas was twice as clean, and therefore, let's give gas a pass. So that was happening, and then at the same time, because of this very large scale up renewables driven by very lucrative policies, the prices really fell, 20-30-fold to make them very competitive. So that's sort of, when people say failure to launch, I mean, I think that those are incredibly strong headwinds that set the stage. So what's different now? Well, I think number one, that there are incentives now. I think in Europe, I mean, every region of the world has a different set of strategies. We have our 45Q. I understand you have something equivalent. We have now like the low carbon fuel standard in California, which is worth $200 a ton. You add that to 45Q, you're talking about $250 per ton is on the table if you can implement CCS. So those incentives, I think, will make a difference. And you said there are like 30 projects in the pipeline. Well, there are probably that many sort of in the U.S. alone, all trying to capture the sort of the highest value opportunities.
Yeah, to be clear, like most of the new projects on the book are in the U.S., which caused me to wonder: is it you got the U.S. as the policy regulatory recipe? Right, driven by the 45Q and California and Oregon's low carbon fuel standard markets.
Right. Well, and I think, in Europe, if we look at the Northern Lights project, if we look at the UK, sort of hub style, projects around hydrogen that would partially be sourced from natural gas with carbon capture and storage, yes, we've got a lot of action in the U.S., but I think there is broader interest. But there's another thing that I think fundamentally changed, and that is the idea of carbon dioxide removal or negative emissions will be needed. The IPCC 1.5 degrees C report, there are almost no scenarios where you can achieve that. We have the IPCC, we have the IEA, major, organizations around the world are saying CCS is needed. I think back, if we look at the failure to launch time, it was like CCS is nice to have, but it wasn't so absolutely certain that it would be.
Sally, would you say that all credible pathways to net zero for the globe pass through a ramp up of carbon capture technologies? Can you say that definitively?
I think so. It's very, very hard to get there. I mean, another example is that, all of these hard to abate emissions, from the cement industry, from the steel industry, and actually even clean firm power, which, yes, maybe we can have 90% renewables or 80% renewables, but that clean firm power, you do need a significant amount. And, maybe that's nuclear, maybe that's gas plus CCS. But there aren't a whole bunch of options for clean firm power, particularly that has good ramping capabilities to back up renewables. So I think that's an important aspect.
Okay. Good.
I think,
Sally,
just two more things quickly.
Sure.
The tech sector. I mean, to me, it was really notable when the Microsoft and the Amazons and the Apples are starting to invest in CCS projects. We look at Microsoft with the Northern Lights project; they're a major investor there. If we look at the Clean Energy Systems project in California, Microsoft is an investor there. These are people who've spent the last 15 years really working hard to decarbonize and finding that they were reaching the end of what they could do with purely renewables. So I think there is a confluence of things that would lead to, 2.0 being different than the first time, but there's still very significant headwinds, particularly around issues of environmental justice. That many think the solution to the climate problem is simply to shut down the oil and gas industry, and certainly that may be one way to do it, but it's my personal view that's going to be difficult to do soon enough to be able to avert a climate crisis.
Got you. Hold that thought, because I want to get back to some of the concerns that folks have, the moral hazard concerns with CCS. But let's get Sara, then David into the conversation. So Sara, you've heard Sally's case. What do you think? Will it be any different than 1.0? Or to add a Canadian context, like the Toronto Maple Leafs, will 2.0 result in yet more disappointment and unfulfilled potential?
I got to figure out how to work in the hockey metaphor. Clearly, I'll see if I can circle back to that. But I do think, for me, I think one of the big pieces, I agree with a lot of what Sally was saying. I think the kind of political will, or whether it's a price on carbon or other policy that basically says we are going to decarbonize, I think that is key for CCS and all of its flavors to happen in any real way, because fundamentally, when it comes down to it, CCS is still a little bit different from something like renewables or an electric vehicle, in that it really is an added cost. If we set aside the utilization, we'll come back to that, but if we set aside the utilization piece, it really, you're adding cost and energy use onto what you're doing without really creating anything new or different or better than what you had before. And when we talk about vehicle electrification, you can debate which is better, but there's certainly some things an EV can do that a conventional internal combustion engine vehicle can't. And so I think that's one thing that's important to keep in mind and thinking about kind of, why you might have had a failure to launch and what has to be different. So the fact that there is more of a push to actually decarbonize, I think, does bode well for a version 2.0. I do think, just to put it back into the Canadian and the Alberta context, we really experienced that failure to launch, right? If you go back to the 2008 Alberta Climate Plan, for the year 2020, there was something like, it's around 30 megatons. It's hard to read from the graph always, but around 30 megatons of carbon capture and storage that was planned as part of the carbon plan. And we ended up with something around, 30 megatons. And we ended up with somewhere around 1 megaton, right? And that was basically essentially it was more than half, the overwhelming majority of Alberta's climate plan in 2008 for last year was carbon capture and storage. And what we saw, in fact, in reality, was that most of our emissions reductions came from the electricity sector. So I think that's it's not a theoretical thing, but this is something that we experienced well.
And I heard, Sara, that carbon plan back in 2008 under the Stelmach government was almost literally written on the back of an envelope. Like, here's how to make the numbers right. 200 megatons, 140. That looks good.
Here's what's there. But I think it's important, plans do serve to direct, where investment goes and where money goes. And I think it is also interesting that Alberta, kind of was able to do a lot of what happened without putting in incentives for renewables or things like that for the most part directly, but kind of riding the wave elsewhere, if you want. And the one other thing that I think that hasn't really changed is the challenge around scaling some of these large capital projects. So it is a lot easier. We do see that a lot of the cost reductions that we've gotten in solar and wind and batteries come from, the 1,000th and then the 10,000th and then the millionth unit that you make. And that's harder to do within carbon capture and storage, especially when we're talking about those big plants. So, don't disagree that, and I feel like I spent a lot of time saying this for all kinds of technologies that people say, well, we're never going to have EVs because look, we haven't had them so far. That's always true for everything until it actually happens. But I think that there are some real challenges around carbon capture that are not, they're just sort of the fundamental challenge of what you're trying to do that can't be changed.
Great. Okay, let's we want to hear from David. Let's launch our poll, our one and only poll today. Budget 2021 proposed an investment tax credit for capital invested in CCUS projects to reduce emissions by at least 15 megatons of CO2 annually. Can we achieve this by 2030.
Hold on. I think the question is actually, will we?
Sure.
There's no question if the government has a national law and forces it with guns, it can happen.
Okay.
The question is it likely to happen?
So let's say, dear viewers, will we achieve this by 2030?
It's a bet.
It doesn't violate the laws of physics,
yeah,
nor policy. Okay, David, what do you think about 1.0 to 2.0?
So I worked a lot on CCS a decade ago and don't very much now. And I was really struck leading up by Sally's note that there's about 40 million tons a year of CCS capacity now worldwide. And one critique of failure to launch is that it didn't fail to launch. So we wouldn't say that battery storage has failed. What is 40 million tons a year work? Well, a gigawatt of solar, if you assume capacity factor of 25% or so, and you assume it's displacing stuff that's half a ton a megawatt hour, that's 1 megaton per year. So that's like 40 gigawatts kind of capacity. So that's much bigger than we have for, say, battery storage, I believe. So I think it's not clear. It certainly didn't go as quickly as people said, but it's not clear that's a failure. I think what Sally didn't say is she gave a bunch of very good reasons why things didn't go quickly. But I think the central reason was government policy on decarbonization is driven primarily by the part of civil society that really cares a lot about decarbonization, by the environmental groups. I'm not a good, I'm part of that world, but I'm obviously, my voice isn't very big. And most of those environmental groups don't think CCS is a major part. And as much as all of us here agreed that it was safe, lots of thoughtful senior people seem to still doubt that it's safe. So I think a significant part of why it didn't launch as much as we expected is that choices around public policy, choices that were fundamentally driven by not everyone, but the mainstream of the environmental movement that lobbied policymakers to put their dollars on renewables and not on CCS. And so I think that's one factor. I think the other factor is this fact that renewables just got very cheap, and that at least in the near term, that was clearly the best thing to do. I think what is puzzling is what happens next, because there's no question that the way we've ramped up renewables into electricity systems was a huge win, but for some environmental issues. But it's going to get harder as the penetration gets higher, and you have to deal with intermittency. And that's where I think we get a second story.
Yeah, this
just to follow up on that.
Sarah.
So I think it's important, given where we focus, to distinguish between the Alberta and Canadian story and the global story, because I think what David is saying for the global story is very true. I would just point out that in Alberta we still have a lot of runway left to go on that so-called deploying easier to scale portion of renewables. So I think we should keep that in mind when we're thinking about where government focus should be within our hometown.
Yeah, on the government focus on the subsidization argument, I used to hear, to name a name, Ben Van Beurden, the head of Shell Global, go to these meetings as part of one of his advisory councils, and he would sort of bemoan the subsidization that renewables got and that CCS didn't get, when I would press him on that 1.0 failure to launch issue. And at the time, frankly, I didn't have a lot of sympathy. I think I have more sympathy for him now. And partly, I was talking to a senior banker with a Big Five bank here in Canada yesterday, and this senior banker heads up this bank's energy transition portfolio. And he said a couple of interesting things. First off, just energy transition writ large. He says, according to the bank, it's going to be the fastest growing vertical they've ever seen in capital markets. That includes tech, SPACs, and even the dot-com era. What he also said, it was interesting. We were talking about CCS. He says, as a Big Five bank, we are ready to deploy capital, but our biggest challenge is government support and regulations, because we've set aside capital with higher risk tolerance. We won't deploy any of it until we understand where we are in the risk spectrum. And something like avoiding compliance costs, alone, like through the carbon tax, that doesn't answer their question. That doesn't get the capital moving. A tax credit like the 45Q, or here in Canada, we've got an investment tax credit that helps to get projects over the finish line if properly designed. That gets the capital moving. That allows project proponents to pay their cost of capital, pay their OPEX, and generate a 10% return. And for me, to answer that question, I think that's the key difference between 1.0 and 2.0. And we've seen the success in the US with the 45Q, coupled with those LCFS markets. And I think we're going to see similar success here in Canada now with the clean fuel regulations coupled with this investment tax credit. Okay, sorry, I'm going to share the results from our poll. It's like a presidential election result in the US, sort of split very evenly. 53% thinks we will achieve 15 megatons of CO2 reductions annually. 47% of you are skeptical.
I'll disclose that I would take a 2-to-1 ratio, maybe a 3-to-1 ratio, that we will not do it.
Okay.
And I put money on it.
Okay. maybe that's a friendly wager, David, and we waited out for 9 years. All right, now let's talk. I want to talk and unpack some of those concerns related to CCS. And David, you really made that point that government policy is driven by civil society, and civil society has had some concerns. I would say not most. I mean, I've been involved in a coalition where we have 6 environmental NGOs and think tanks who really understand the role of CCS and support it the way you do in the US with, say, the Clean Air Task Force. But to bring it home, I got a comment on LinkedIn yesterday when I was promoting this episode, and I got to quote it, and I want Sally, first, you to respond. For God's sakes, Ed, we know that we can do 95% of our energy without CCS. Just build renewables. Why do you keep playing to the oil and gas industry? So I told this commenter, you're wrong, but I said, tune in tomorrow to find out why. So Sally, am I right in saying he's wrong?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that there are 2 things. One is electricity, and then there's energy, and they're really very different things. So for electricity, I think it really depends. If you've got a lot of hydro that is, reliable, all year long, and you augment that with some wind and some solar, maybe you do get 95% of the way there. We've done a lot of studies in California, very detailed electricity system modeling, and we can get about 80% of our energy from renewables, but that last 20%, yes, you can do it, but it comes at a huge cost of massive overbuild of solar, massive overbuild of storage. So there it's 20%. We like clean firm power. Again, where it comes from is another issue. California's got a lot of natural gas, a lot of CCS capability, so CCS would be beneficial there. So back to the other 95% of energy. When you look at these hard to abate emissions, when you look at industrial activities that require very high intensity heat, we don't really have a good set of electrification options for those yet today. McKenzie recently published a very interesting study where they looked at various scenarios where electricity went from sort of being the cost it is today to something in the range of 5 cents a kilowatt hour down to like 2 cents a kilowatt hour. And they concluded that under all of those scenarios that CCS would still be the preferred option for decarbonizing sort of the big 4 emitting industries. Even when power was really cheap. Now, when power got really cheap, the hydrogen and electrification of some of the very high and high heat demand industries may be possible. But even then, CCS was still the biggest one. So, 95% economy wide, I don't think so. Studies place that more like 25% would fall into the hard to abate emission category, where either CCS or CDR would be the preferred approach.
Got you. So it's still some time before we're going to electrify, say, cement plants and blast furnaces in steel facilities. They are there, and with cement, there are theoretical chemistries as well. They will play a role, but with cement especially, I assume that in the near term, we're looking at carbon capture.
Right, in the near term.
Yeah. Okay. Sara?
Yeah. So 2 thoughts on this. So one is, I think, the moral hazard argument is out there. I still come back to the actual experience argument, which is Alberta spent over $1 billion. The government of Alberta spent over $1 billion on CCS, and that was the central piece of the plan. And that came at the expense of spending that $1 billion on other stuff. So I think that it's not, to me, this theoretical argument of, well, if we do this, then that, maybe makes space to do more oil and gas expansion. It's in fact what happened. And when you're talking about spending government money, you have this sort of fixed or somewhat fixed amount, or their trade-offs at least. So I think that's important to acknowledge. I think when it comes into like the subsidies piece and the Anglo support, there I would point to kind of a couple of different things. So one is, the oil and gas sector does receive a lot of subsidies, and the extent to which it is that sector that is going to be, owning, operating, and really driving parts of the CCS value chain, I think I would turn that around and say, well, if they think that that's an important thing to be subsidized, how can they encourage governments to redirect subsidies that they're getting into CCS, right? I think there's not a shortage of funds there available if that is a priority. So I don't have a lot of sympathy for that. We don't have any money available. And then, within the Anglo space, I guess it comes down to me, the civil society that is advocating for new technologies and solutions, in particular, because they are areas that lack that support otherwise. I think it's very logical then that the Anglo sector wouldn't focus on technologies that are supported by companies that have a lot of lobbying power and ability to lobby. So I actually don't think that that's, I guess as someone who does see that, yes, there is certainly a piece of our future net zero energy mix that includes CCS, I would assign the responsibility for making that happen to the oil and gas companies, not to the Anglos, who maybe should be spending more time paying attention to sectors that have even less potential support for them.
There's lots there. I want to dive into inefficient subsidies and this unpacking this whole issue of what is a subsidy, what isn't a subsidy, what applies to oil and gas, what applies to everyone. I would love if we had time to, because a lot of Anglo concerns around, frankly, CCS and its link to EOR. I'd love to unpack that. But David, you want to come back to this renewables question.
Yeah, I mean, so the person asked you, if we can do 95% renewables, shouldn't we just do that? CCS is just to help the oil industry. So I want the oil industry to be hammered because it's been driving CO2 emissions, no question. But I care about both solving the climate problem and managing other environmental problems. And the reality is that CCS in some cases will have much lower or significantly lower environmental impacts than renewables. We really need to think about it. So solar, you can scale to tens of terawatts, enough to power the whole world with pretty low impacts. That's not possible with wind. You do something like a terawatt of wind in North America, and you have substantial climate impacts and land footprint. There are now 300 papers that basically show that, including observations. You do biofuels, same. Nothing that we do at large scale has no environmental impact. All energy systems hurt the environment. But I think the substantive reason, if you care about the environment, is that CCS has a pathway to have very low land footprint and be low on other environmental attributes. And that matters a lot to me.
Mm-hmm. Can I ask David a question on that? Because so in order for the CCS to actually work from a climate perspective, right, we need to be using low carbon power or you need to, so how does CCS for power generation, I guess, at a large scale help you out on the land impacts?
Well, because if you did, so for power generation, if you did natural gas plus CCS, you're making zero carbon electricity, and that competes with other ways to make zero carbon electricity. And natural gas plus CCS has a bunch of environmental impacts, from drilling the natural gas wells and moving the pipeline and so on. And you can add those up. And making the power from wind backed up by pumped hydro, for example, has a bunch of impacts, and you can add them up. And you actually have to add them up and do the environmental analysis. And there's no question we have to decarbonize, but the environmental community has to get beyond saying all renewables equals green, because they're not.
Yeah. And that's, so I want, and I know we're cutting into our Q&A time, but I really want to talk about the environmental community's concern around the links of CCS to EOR, because a bunch of my former colleagues in civil society wrote a sign-on letter to the feds in early March with a few dozen signatories, and their advocacy really helped to tip the balance for the federal government to scope out EOR as a qualified project from its CCUS ITC. And I get those concerns, and maybe Sally, I'd love to get your comment. I kind of think it's more symbolism than anything, because the net carbon balance from CO2 to EOR, and further, Sara, to your question on net carbon balance, depending on your source of electricity or power for a CCS project, in the case of EOR, it just varies so much amongst the geologies and even the strategies that companies are using. And I would say, and I have said to my colleagues, I don't think you need to fight a keep it in the ground campaign on a reservoir by reservoir basis. That's dictated by global supply and demand. So I think it's symbolism. I don't think the new net production you would bring on and those emissions would be frankly substantial, even if you, like the US does, allowed CCS for EOR. And it's not productive to characterize, this is good and this is bad, the CCS, we just need more of it. Sally, you're in the US, that's been a hot topic. What do you think?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, like David, I actually have a tremendous concern for the environment, and development of new oil fields, has a very, very, significant environmental footprint, particularly in wilderness areas. So, we as a global society are going to continue to use oil for quite a while. I don't know exactly how long, and it's certainly going to ramp down. But in order to provide the oil that the world is going to need, we have two choices. We can try to get it out of our existing reservoirs, or we can continue to explore for new reservoirs, which will have a even greater environmental footprint over time. I would way rather that we have a brownfield strategy for any new oil that's needed, any replacement oil, and to the extent that CO2 EOR you can use that associated with old oil field that doesn't require going into pristine wilderness areas. I'm very, very supportive of that. So I am not anti EOR from that perspective, because I think it can have environmental benefits. Now my own work is focused on CO2 storage and saline formations, and that's what I think is the long-term scalable solution. But I will say one other thing is that it's actually possible to put so much CO2 underground that it would actually offset the emissions for a barrel of oil, in this exact same oil field. So if you just double the ratio of amount of CO2 you put underground per barrel of oil that you're producing today, depending upon where you draw your boundaries, that can become a carbon neutral activity. So it is possible that there are synergies between climate solutions and CO2 EOR that really have yet to be exploited or explored.
Okay, we've had a question in the chat, I realize, and I've been guilty of this. EOR is enhanced oil recovery for those non-CCS geeks who might be tuning in. And that's essentially the concept of using captured CO2, or even in some cases atmospheric CO2, and using that for CO2 flood to get oil or gas hydrocarbons out of most often depleted reservoirs. So sorry to not define that. Let's go to our first questioner, Richard Adamson, and of course, our former Carbon Management Canada colleague for Sally and me. So Richard, welcome.
Thanks a lot, Ed. And Sally, it's absolutely terrific to see you again. It's been a long time. And I really appreciated you making the point that CCS is not a technology, but a suite of technologies. That precise language is important, especially as we move towards carbon management systems, where the whole carbon capture and storage complex gets to be sliced and diced a lot of new ways that we haven't even considered yet. Regarding chemical as opposed to nature-based CDR, what's normally referred to as direct air capture, because of the net cycle energy economics, the gigajoules per ton required, do you see this as being practical for broad implementations, not just a few demonstration projects, but on the orders of gigatons per year globally? you think we can get there? And I obviously I want to hear from David. I probably couldn't hold him back anyway, but I'd like to hear from David.
There you go, David. Richard did my work for me.
But Sally first, I think the question was to Sally.
Oh, no. I want to hear what you, I mean, you are much more.
So first of all, I don't think DAC is necessarily, well, I don't know where to start. Nature-based is an oxymoron under the formal definitions of carbon balance the IPCC adopted. So it's not nature if you're manipulating nature to put more carbon in. That's not to say some of it doesn't make a lot of sense or isn't useful, but I think it's really important not to fall into kind of false terminology. So all these industrial methods require energy, and I don't think we know how much different ones. I certainly don't think DAC is the only one. The one that I think is probably most scalable if you want to go really fast is adding alkalinity to the ocean. And in principle, it's actually energy negative because it's thermodynamically favored. In practice, I think we don't know. You're probably looking at many, like 5 gigajoules per ton. But I think we just don't know. My view is that carbon removal in those systems tends to make sense only once we've squeezed sort of 2/3 or so out of the emissions out of the energy system. I don't think it's something people should be doing at large scale now. And I don't see the energy use as a big deal given the energy use that we believe now. So the system that we developed at Carbon Engineering has one of the highest energy uses, and it's something like 8 or 7 or whatever, depending on how you measure it, gigajoules a ton. We can certainly make it lower. It's a trade-off. And when you look at that in terms of the real footprint of the energy systems feeding it, I don't see that as a showstopper. When you compare it to other ways to do the same thing, which is to squeeze those last 20 or 30% of emissions out.
Sara, you want to jump in?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think I really like how David is putting it in sort of all these things are a question of not necessarily can we physically do this thing, but which is the better option, right? And I think that's a big part for me of the direct air capture story, which is that for a lot of things, there is going to be an alternative that is better because it is so energy intensive. And then looking at, where it is, say, the cheapest or the preferable solution, I think is how you come up with the right answer rather than kind of, could we do this all through this, magic sucking the carbon out of the air?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, maybe I'll just weigh in on this. I mean, I think there are lots of trade-offs. If you're using all that energy, it's good to use it for CDR versus, other things that could help decarbonize the economy. But I think there are other things, like there are all these things like we could do and we might do, but if it requires involving so many actors to change behavior, change technology, make investments, they may not be prepared to invest in. And if you look at something which could in principle be much simpler, like, the governments could basically run very big CDR projects on behalf of, all the people who haven't yet reduced emissions. And it would be a way to actually get something done. So I think we also have to look at the trade-off of, how easy will it be to implement CDR versus, for example, all these other solutions that are available.
But I'd love to get your take on it, Sally, within the, let's call it, non-biological permanent side of CDR, because trees, wetlands, soil regeneration, that's great. It's biological. It's impermanent, as we talked about with Mark Tursick late last year. But within the non-biological permanent side, and full disclosure, like David, I have a carbon engineering affiliation, but my understanding is that compared to ocean-based technologies or BECCS or carbon mineralization, that direct air capture is just the most advanced at this point. What's your sense?
I wouldn't say it's more advanced than BECCS. I mean, BECCS is something we can just do. We know how to burn biomass to make power, and we know how to capture CO2. So, I think compared to, for example, putting, particles of, ground up ultramafic rocks on soils and having them, pick up CO2 from the atmosphere and convert it to carbonates. I actually think that's much more immature than, for example, DEC. So on the spectrum, I would, put it sort of in the low middle, side of, even though we can do it, it's a long way from being cost competitive to, for example, some others, many other solutions that are available today.
Okay,
I would completely agree with Sally. So I did work, as people know, on carbon engineering, but I also had the first PhD who worked on BECCS and pushed BECCS into the IPCC. And my sense is they're both at kind of similar levels of development now. Maybe BECCS a little further along in some ways. It just isn't a focus of policy deployment. But I think that I think the big question is really the following: is the goal to kill the fossil fuel industry, or is that a intermediate goal? And really what we want to do is reduce the environmental impact of our energy system and solve the climate problem. And if it's the later, then I think people need to ask themselves if it's really true, and I don't think we know that it is, that you could do very large scale carbon removal using, say, some ocean alkalinity or DAC system that was, say, at $150 a ton, counting the energy needed to feed it. So counting the solar farm that feeds it inside that fence. If that's true, and why should we do other stuff that costs more than $150 a ton? That's the fundamental question.
True. And just to give some relative numbers, when I talk to the steel industry, they say their decarbonization all-in cost is $300 a ton. And I think if you change out airline fuel infrastructure, you're looking at $600 a ton. So if CDR can take CO2 out of the air for $150 a ton, why would we do that more expensive re-engineering of infrastructure? You just do CDR at that price level all day long.
And to me, then it comes back again to, I think Sally's point of like, what is the easiest to actually get done? And in some ways, you could say, well, change the lack of the need for behavior change makes something like CDR easier. But the flip side of that is that if you view it as purely a cost with a benefit that is global, that's actually, in some sense, really hard to get governments to do, right? Like, why would we ever, to put the argument out there, why, would Canada ever pay anything to do this? Whereas some of the other solutions might provide other benefits or could grow a market or could grow some kind of product or thing that would deliver benefits. So I think it's, it's an important piece of the calculation of, who's actually going to be paying for this at the end of the day is maybe even the harder problem than the technological one.
Okay. All right. I'm resisting the temptation to talk about trees when we're talking about biological impermanent CDR and to deride the trillion tree initiative where Canada's got a 2 billion tree initiative. Okay. Well, I'll stay away from trees. I want to get to the next question. Unless someone wants to work in trees into their response to this, from Roman Zombak. He asks, the risk I see with CCS is that it may not be a transition pathway, not the ultimate solution. My worry is that CCS acceptance may be short-lived. What is your sense on this?
I mean, maybe I'll jump in. I mean, my sense is the reason, well, there are, I think, two big reasons for resistance to CCS from the public at large. One is the anti-fossil fuel mentality that that's the only way to solve the climate problem. The other one is it's very unfamiliar, and therefore people are reluctant to do something that's so unfamiliar. In my sense is that if we start doing it, people will realize, at scale, and that people, drive by a CCS facility and there's nothing very exciting happening there, that people will feel much more comfortable with it because that it will eliminate that this is an unfamiliar technology. And, and the issue with regard to, will people change their view about, whether we just need to get rid of fossil fuels? I have no idea. That there are very strong feelings about that issue, but certainly the familiarity I think will help. So I think it will only get better over time once implementation starts.
But a question, Sally, is that like geography dependent or jurisdiction dependent? Because you take Alberta here, and as I say, I did like community workshops around the Shell Quest CCS project. There were concerns about safety pretty quickly addressed when Shell said, here's our MMV plan and our emergency response plan. And you have a population that is just used to big oil and gas infrastructure crisscrossing their land, whether it be wells or pipelines. The Netherlands, you could not get a CCS project done by Shell in its home country because of local concerns. So are we talking that it's not just a matter of where the point source emissions are or the suitable geography happens to be, it's really where you're going to get that public acceptance, and it won't be universal.
Right. Yeah. And I agree. It's very local. And if you look at the problem with the Shell project, I mean, that built on a very long history of a large amount of induced seismicity that was associated with petroleum extraction. And the community was already, very unhappy with the status quo. I mean, that's what they found is if you go into a community where there's already a big dislike of an industry and that industry tries to do something new and big, it's really hard to get it done. So, it's going to be, this will be a local issue. And, maybe then you move offshore. Maybe that's why you do DAC, because you can, move it to someplace where people may actually be interested in that technology and the jobs that it would provide.
All right, let's get another question here. So from Catherine McCreary, is it too simplistic to require that the price of fossil fuels be taxed to get funding for capturing and storing the resultant carbon dispersed? So I think what you're saying here, we kind of touched upon it, is can't you just get carbon capture through things like Canada's carbon tax?
Or a performance standard. There's lots of ways to do it.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. There just has to be a carrot or a stick, right? If it's a carrot, well, okay, there's an incentive. If it's a stick, it's a tax, but you have to do something. You can't do nothing because nothing doesn't work because these are commodity products. And if one person is producing it at $1 and the other person is producing it at $1.10, people are going to buy the one for $1. So there has to be, a level playing field for different producers of those same products. That's the huge problem with cement too, right? That if in California, for example, we decided to put a penalty on the emissions from a cement plant that was produced in California, we would be just buying cement from another state that doesn't have that tax.
I want to come quickly back. Oh, sorry, you first, Sarah.
I was just going to say on the point around the cement, and I think it applies to the fossil fuels as well. I think that's an important role for policy because, with the cement example, and I think the same is true to an extent with the fossil fuels. If the cost is borne by the producer, as you say, that's makes it very hard to prevent leakage or just going elsewhere. You need full coverage, but the cost of the low carbon cement itself for the end user, for the builder of the building that has the cement in it, the additional cost for making that carbon neutral is actually relatively small compared to the total cost. And so that's where a policy that is sometimes different or at least somewhat more sophisticated than just a price can actually be more effective, in an imperfect world where you don't have everybody having a price applied, because you can sort of allow for those costs to be paid by somebody who can afford them if you want, or who sort of doesn't then have a choice because you can't build your building outside of Canada if you want a building in Canada at the end of the day. So I think there's there's something similar that it probably applies for carbon capture as well.
And Sarah, just to be clear, you're talking about something like a buy clean policy. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, at the end of the day, of course, then a combustion-based fossil fuel carbon price would achieve that same thing, right? And so I think we are living that experiment. The question was, can we do that? Well, can the price in Canada rise to $150? I guess tune in over the next 10 years and we'll see.
Yeah.
So I want to.
In reality, we've been paying more for all the decarbonization that we're doing than the carbon taxes or cap and trade prices. We've been paying hundreds and hundreds of dollars a ton, sometimes even thousands of dollars a ton for our policies to get where we are.
Yeah.
I want to come in quickly on the question. I think was one back on one argument against CCS is say, well, it's not the ultimate answer; it's a bridge. And if we know the ultimate answer is renewables, we should just do it. I think the truth is the only constant in the energy system over the last 1,000 years has been change. And we have no idea what the ultimate answer is. So I think we should think pragmatically. In the long run, we'll all be dead. What we need to deal with is how we're going to drive emissions down quickly over the kind of lifetime of us and our kids and have policies to do that. And it seems to me highly unlikely that the ultimate answer involves biofuels or wind. And I think solar is much more likely to be stable. But when we have nano fusion reactors that are this big and, or 500 megawatts each, why would you bother with solar panels? We have no idea what the ultimate answer is. There isn't one. Things keep changing.
All right. Last comment for me, because we talked about cement and on government policy. There's an exciting announcement on Monday with a low carbon concrete roadmap. And I think if I look in the short term and see what might happen here in Canada, that plus a well-designed investment tax credit, hitting the standards of incentivization in the US just might get projects like Lehigh Cement's plant in Edmonton going. And maybe David and I, just down the valley from here, there's a big cement plant, Lafarge, and we might get them capturing their CO2 and injecting it in some near geology. Okay, we're at the top of the hour. We're going to have to leave it at that. Sally, thank you.
We seem to have lost Ed thanks to his unstable internet. So I guess I will step in and wrap it up to thank Sally so much for joining us. A reminder to everybody that this episode will be available as an at energyversusclimate.com for reviewing, or as a podcast on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, or wherever you listen. Our next episode is coming in 2 weeks. It's going to be our last episode of the season. Make sure you're subscribed so you find out the topic and guest as we're finalizing that. And as a reminder, you can give us feedback at energyversusclimate at gmail.com. Thanks to our very patient producer, Eva Wojniewski, and to Mika McFarlane for his superb webinar support. And see you all in 2 weeks.
Thank you.
Thank you. Great to see you.
Bye-bye.